the mechanism by which we apply our solution.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shaw. Rick, I'll call next Rick Gates.
You're probably all wondering why I called you here this evening. I always want to say that. My name is Rick Gates, and I just recently moved to Toronto a year ago. I'm from Nova Scotia. And first, I'd like to thank you as members of the committee for giving me this opportunity tonight to be able to express my views of the country and how I feel. And I will attempt to express my views of 25 years and into the time allotted for me this evening, so please bear with me. I'm very intrigued and yet somewhat bewildered at all these committees and commissions that have been formed over the past few months. And I will expand upon this later in my presentation. As an individual, since I'm not representing any specific group, there's three areas that I feel that need to be addressed by the leaders of Ontario and Canada. And these are just basically my views. I'm sure other Canadians think other issues are more pertinent. One is Canada's leadership in the political system as a whole, two, the Native people, and three, regional disparity. In the first issue, our leadership in our political system. And this is probably definitely the most important factor in keeping Canada together, since it will be leadership that will pull Canada out of this post-Meach mess. This issue relates directly to my earlier statement as to my wonder and bewilderment of all these new committees that are now studying Canada's future. Over the past few months, we've seen the formation of Canada's Spicer Commission, Quebec's Belanger-Campeau Commission, and now the Select Committee on Ontario and Confederation. I am intrigued because nothing like this has ever happened before in Canadian politics. But I'm bewildered because why now? Where were these committees and commissions before Meech Lake? Why are political leaders in all levels of government reactionaries? It is so easy for someone to set up a committee after the event, after Meech Lake had failed. But it takes a real leader to foresee a potential crisis and create a solution through consensus. Where are the visionaries that will lead Canada into the 21st century? It was real leaders of all political stripes that helped Canada grow into the nation it is today. Leaders who challenged us and challenged society. Whether it had been greater independence from Great Britain in the beginning, or whether creating a Medicare system envied by other countries around the world, a Bill of Rights, our own Constitution, vast social programs aimed at assisting all Canadians, or just even promoting our multiculturalism. It took leaders with a vision for Canada. And all of these committees and commissions should have been set up before Meech Lake, not after. We should have learned that even though the government who patriated the Constitution in 1982 used a very flawed system that itself almost self-destructed. It kind of reminds me of the sinking of the Titanic. It was not till after the ship had sunk that a commission had been set up and realized that with a few more lifeboats, possibly everyone could have been saved. The shipbuilder did not have the foresight to see the potential disaster, as with our present leaders. But as a Canadian, I refuse to sit on the deck and play a piano while the ship is sinking and Quebec jumps ship. Canada is not just in an economic recession. Worse, we are in a political depression. If you as representatives of the Ontario government want concrete recommendations and not just generalities as how to fill this political vacuum, then this committee is one perfect example. This committee is an excellent idea, but I'm afraid it may be a bit too late. It is the timing and the lack of vision for Canada. Canada cannot keep plotting a course for the future day by day. Meech Lake was a perfect example of what Canada needed, compromising. Meech Lake, with all its flaws, was good for Canada because everyone compromised. It was not Meech Lake itself that led to its destruction. It was the secretive process that gave it its birth in the first place. I do not believe that governments are re-elected based on numbers like they like to believe. History has shown us that governments have been elected and re-elected no matter what the deficit, or the inflation, or the unemployment rate was. If that was the case, I'm sure previous governments never would have been re-elected. But rather, they were elected on their principles, honesty, and openness. And this is probably another recommendation, openness. We're seeing more of it now, and it's most welcome. But it was not until after years and years of secretive negotiations and closed-door meetings that the public finally had enough and are now demanding a change. And I think we saw that last June when Mulroney and the 11 ministers all rolled the dice. Politicians are pulling everything they are doing and saying and reacting to every little decision. Our leaders are not leading a nation, but are finding themselves being led. My second point this evening is the Native people. Since the time of Confederation, each province has been granted certain powers and a form of self-government. The French have their own province and their own laws and powers to protect their heritage. But yet the Native people of this land have been, by and large, ignored. After 124 years of Royal Commission after Royal Commission studying every aspect of the Native people, nothing has really been done. And finally, did Canada witness the Native people's frustration last summer? Canadians have this uncanny ability to accept this situation as an unfortunate mistake in our history and with no real commitment to change. A perfect example of this was the events of last summer. During the standoff at Oka, we witnessed support and sympathy, genuine support and sympathy for the Mohawks. But as soon as the issue was resolved, both the federal government and us as a society seemed almost immediately to put it behind us. If we sit by and do nothing, we will certainly be reacting again to an even greater crisis. But as potential visionaries, which I believe we all are, we have a great opportunity to start righting some wrongs. We need to start acting now. Native people need self-government. But by only giving self-government to the Native people in Ontario, it will only help the Native people of this province and leave others out of the process to fend with their own governments, which will probably each have different priorities. Ontario needs to encourage the other provinces to join in with the federal government to set up governing councils in each of the provinces. These governing councils would have independent laws and powers to protect their culture, their language, and race, and yet work within the laws of Canada. Since it would be very difficult to set up a separate province for the Native people, guaranteed national representation would be needed in the federal government through the House of Commons, the Senate, and the Supreme Court of Canada. This representation would be entrenched in Canada's Constitution. By granting the Native people these basic rights and powers, they would be on the road towards self-respect and dignity, something that is long overdue to one of the founding members of this nation. And this may seem a little extreme, but I'm going to use it anyways. Even though apartheid is not practiced in Canada as it is in South Africa, I do find some very ironic similarities. Sure, we can say that the Native people are free to go and live anywhere they want in Canada, that they are as free as you and me here in this room. But are they really? The democratic freedom may be there in theory, but is it there in spirit? The Native people are not as free as we like to think they are. Our educational system is certainly not designed for them. We put them on reservation. They were put on reservations which took away their independence. They are now dependent on a system that never really worked for them. Compare the townships of South Africa with that of the reservations here in Canada. They both have many things in common. The higher death rates, the higher crime rates, alcoholism, the list goes on and on. I find it very hard to call them the Native people of Canada. I do not believe that they feel like they are part of Canada, and I do not know if they want to be associated with Canada. We as a society have done far better with integrating people from other lands and cultures than we have with the Native people here. If we continue to ignore addressing the real issues of the Native people in the next few years, then I believe the world community will view Canada as a totally different country from the generous one it is viewed as today. But far worse is the possibility that Canadians and the Native people may lose the one last chance to live together in peace and harmony. And my last point is regional disparity. Regional tensions have varied over the past 124 years. Usually it's been between Ottawa and the provinces and not directly between the provinces themselves. But why is that? And I believe it derives from two things, power and money. First, power. And each of the provinces basically have the same amount of powers as handed out in the British North America Act of 1867. That we know. But each province can individually negotiate for more powers or for more money from the federal government, as we've seen with the Quebec government striking a deal with the federal government over immigration. And this is where the identical powers of each of the provinces come under the BNA Act become misleading. The true power and influence comes from the amount of the province's MPs in the House of Commons. The province with the more seats in the House of Commons usually finds it easier to deal with the federal government and to get what they want, regionalism. It is for this reason that many Westerners and the maritime provinces feel neglected by the federal government. Many Westerners and Maritimers feel that central Canada is catered to. It would only make political sense, since Ontario and Quebec hold 174 out of the 295 seats, almost 60%, it would only make political sense that a federal government would tend to be more sensitive to their needs. So by giving provincial governments more federal powers, it would not necessarily make them more equal, since they still rely on transfer payments from the federal government. And with the status quo in the House of Commons still remaining the same, the federal government would still cater to the needs of Quebec and Ontario in order to remain in power come the next federal election. Ontario and the other provinces must also keep in mind that they can barely afford to fund the present programs that are already under their jurisdiction, even with the present transfer payments from the federal government. Between 1984 and 1986, the federal government cut transfer payments to the provinces by some $6 billion. If Ontario and the other provinces want more federal powers transferred to them, it would only make sense if these powers were already presently duplicated by both levels of government and that a definite guarantee of funding were to come from the federal government. Since the provinces are going to look out for their interests first and foremost, and with the representation of the House of Commons remaining the same, it would be nearly impossible to erase regionalism from Canada's political landscape. But one arm of the parliamentary system which could give more powers to the provinces and yet make the House of Commons more democratic to the needs of all regions of Canada would be the restructuring of the Senate. By creating an equal elected and effective Senate, all regions of Canada with the same power and influence in the federal government, and the end result would be less regionalism in Canada. The Senate could prevent unnecessary catering to more powerful provinces in the House of Commons, creating a more equal and democratic country. But one thing that cannot stop regionalism, unfortunately, is ignorance. And ignorance knows no borders. It is leaders such as these that make hasty comments or uneducated decisions which could have a profound effect on the other regions and the nation as a whole. When it comes to dealing with the Constitution, Canada's 11 First Ministers must rise above partisan and regional politics. An example would be Quebec's recently released Allaire report. And we do not need leaders making comments that may win them political points at home, but rather benefit Canada as a whole. We need compassionate leaders that can understand Quebec's frustration and that the Allaire report is at least another start, and Ontario should be embracing that initiative. By stating that this and that is wrong with the Allaire report, Ontario would be sending a signal to the people of Quebec that we are in no mood to listen and negotiate. We must proceed with a cautious, patient, and positive approach. Canada, for the first time in its history, has a possibility of breaking up. For it is not just Quebec who is unhappy with the present form of federalism. And lastly, I guess I'd like to mention that it seems over the past few months that Canada's identity, or its soul, have you, whatever you want to call it, has changed from regions who work together to build a nation to a nation falling apart because of its regions. And to me, I find that a very, very ironic demise. And hopefully this committee will be able to do something about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gates. Quick question, Mr. Bisson.
He's going to be last on the list. I got the Snickers. You raised a couple of points that were interesting. I was mulling over as you were speaking in the end. It seems to me that maybe one of the problems that we have is that we somehow are trying to change the way that we think, change the way that we do things when it comes to our federal and provincial governments in regards to imposing timelines and saying, you know, things have to be done in such a way, like in a neat, orderly business fashion. Unfortunately, and fortunately at the same time, a country is much more than that. It has to be the whole democratic process. I want to get back when you talked about that part of the problems that we have is that the structure of the federal system is that the province with the most amount of seats within the House is that who gets the most attention. And you gave us an alternative, having an elected Senate. I don't want to get so much in the debate of the Senate other than in the debate around the House of Commons, is that there's an argument on one side. It is if you say the House of Commons has to have equal representation by the provinces, how do you recognize that Ontario, that clearly has the largest portion of majority as far as the population in this country in Quebec, would get equal representation than, let's say, PEI or British Columbia, and vice versa? How do you address that? Because
you see, that's where the Senate would offset the House of Commons, the imbalance in the House of Commons. I mean, by looking at the present system as it is, you know, Atlantic Canada only has 32 seats, and whether that's, whether it would be fair for us to have the same amount of seats as Ontario and Quebec that have 2/3 of the population, I don't think that would be acceptable. But the Senate, to me, could off-balance that catering by saying the Senate, by making it elected and effective, meaning that it could thwart any programs that the federal government would benefit Ontario and Quebec. And the Senate would offset. See, right now the way it looks, it would take maybe some of the heat off the provinces, because whenever a premier of a province speaks up, they're speaking for that region. And, you know, when you have 11 men or women in a room fighting, you know, that creates regionalism. But if you took it off that and you put it from one man or woman head of a province to maybe 10 or 15 or 20, whatever the amount of seats would be broken up, per province, I think that would also break the regionalism. You wouldn't have a province saying, you know, the Premier of Nova Scotia saying, you know, I speak for Nova Scotia federally. No, he doesn't. The Senate does. And to me, that, I think, would help break regionalism in Canada.
We're going to move on. Thank you, Mr. Gates. Thanks very much. We do have two other speakers who had been given to understand that they were going to be heard this evening, and so I'd like to, with the bearance of the committee, move to them now. And we'll ask the speakers to be as brief as they can. The first is Pierre-Eddy Toussaint from Alliance Etienne. I think he was in the room earlier, just stepped outside. All right, is Dave Huband here? Huband, sorry. We could start with you, sir, and we'll get to Mr. Toussaint later then. Huband, H-U-B-A-N-D.
My name is David Huband. I'm an actor, comedian, and I've been living and sometimes working in Toronto for the last 9 years. I appreciate the opportunity to speak before this committee tonight. In the past, issues such as Meech Lake and the free trade debate have almost totally excluded the voting public in the political process, and it is a welcome change that ordinary citizens such as myself have a chance to be part of the dialogue in determining the future of Canada. For that, I once again thank the committee for allowing me to be part of that dialogue. I really had no idea what I wanted to talk to you about today, so thank you and good night. No, kidding. I was talking to a friend of mine last week about a really bad television show on the CBC called Urban Angel. It's a new show, and my friend asked me why it was so bad, and I said, well, it tries too hard to be like a typical American cop show. All the elements are there, you know, the violence, drugs, prostitutes, the obligatory car chase. But somehow it just didn't cut it. It was missing something. And I said, you know, I wish Canadian producers would come up with a television show that truly reflects the Canadian experience. And my friend asked me, what would that be? And I said, I don't know. I was really stumped. So I said, well, I guess before you can come up with a show that reflects the Canadian identity, first of all, you have to come up with a Canadian identity. What does Canada stand for? What does it mean to be a Canadian? Our people have been grappling with these questions virtually since our inception as a nation. We can look to our past for some clues and find that we have deep-rooted ties with the British, the French, and Native peoples. We can look to the present and find that the Americans have a huge influence on our daily lives. But what of the future? What will influence us or define us as a people in the 21st century? And I asked a lot of my friends and a lot of people in the last little while, what would you define as being the Canadian identity? And most everyone said, nice. We are a nice people. Canada is a nice place to live. We exude niceness. Well, is that it? Will Canada be doomed to go down in history as being a nice